Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I'm honored and thrilled to have with me Mr. Ahsan Butt, who is an associate professor at the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Thank you very much, Dr. Butt, for your time for my YouTube channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. So, the today's question is very important that the world order is changing. So, while you are an academic, you are based in U.S. in Washington. How do you see this changing order while sitting in Washington, and particularly while you have just seen some optics in the Pacific, where we have seen the U.S. Special the Nancy Pelosi was there in Taiwan, and we have seen that the Chinese militaristic designs have also come in front of us. The Chinese call that provocation. So, how do you see this developing international order? First, if we can have a short conversation on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a very important question in international politics, and I think a lot of academic researchers are working on the rise of China, the implications of the rise of China. Certainly, it's a big topic. Graduate students write a lot of dissertations on these topics. We see a lot of articles and books being published on these topics. So it's certainly a hot topic in our field. I think there's when we talk about the rise of China and sort of changes in international order, I think there's maybe two or three sort of elements that I would break that down into. One is ideational and norms, right? So for instance, China has different views than the prevailing so-called liberal international order. China has different views on things like human rights or humanitarian intervention on human rights. China may have different views on the trade-off between respecting sort of self-determination versus respecting borders. So that's a trade-off, right? In the international order, you want to give minorities the right, or ethnic minorities or religious minorities the right to for self-determination, but there's also inbuilt into the international order a respect for borders or a respect for sovereignty, that we're not going to change borders. And so those two ideas are diametrically opposed. So the international order has set one particular line for where that trade-off is, and maybe China wants to change where that line is on self-determination versus respect for borders. For instance, China may have much more respect for borders and much less respect for self-determination than the prevailing international order has it. Um, so on democracy, for instance, on the promotion of democracy and the extent to which that should be a reasonable or feasible or viable goal for world superpowers, as it has been for the last 70 years. So certainly, ideationally, China challenges a lot of the prevailing norms and ideas of the international system. And then if we move to away from norms and ideas to sort of brute power politics, China's rise is also in some cases reaffirming existing alliance patterns, in some cases is challenging existing alliance patterns. Certainly in Asia, you could see sort of, I'm sure we're going to get to this, but the birth of a very strong relationship between the US and India, which would not be possible or viable in a world without a rising China, for instance. You see things like the Quad, right, where the US and Australia and Japan and India are much closer today than they would have been otherwise if it weren't for the rise of China. Uh, and by the same token, you see, challenges in other parts of the world that the West has gotten either used to sort of having dominion over, such as the US and Latin America, or the West has gotten used to this sort of benign neglect, as in sub-Saharan Africa. In both those types of places, China is making more of an effort. Doesn't mean that it's certainly in Latin America, doesn't mean it's displacing or replacing the US by any stretch. But certainly, China challenges existing alliance patterns, existing spheres of influence. Um, and so, both when we talk about norms and ideas, as well as when we talk about power politics, such as alliances, uh, it's certainly the case that China's rise is having and will continue to have a huge effect on international politics.
So, in all that developing international order, where do you see South Asia, and particularly since you also mentioned about India? So, how do you see India's rise in South Asia, and where does this fit in the international order? Since there has been a conversation in the West about the illiberal democracy in India, illiberal order there. There have been questions about what we call that how the human rights violations are there. At the same time, we also believe that uh, the West, and particularly the United States, it doesn't seem that it is as careful about human rights as it was in the past. So, how do you see India in the future, and how do you think the West is going to embrace India?
Sorry, just in that last 10 or 15 seconds, your voice got cut out. If you could just repeat the last couple of sentences.
I was just saying that how do you see how do you see the rise of India, in fact, basically in this world order, and how do you see the West is going to receive India?
Yeah, I think I can't speak for the West in general, but certainly in Washington D.C. and in the U.S. sort of foreign policy and national security elite, India is seen as a very important player to counter the rise of China, and I mean, the relationship with India is not reducible to the rise of China, but certainly the rise of China has given it a big boost. If you go back even to the 90s and early 2000s, when both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, from diametrically opposed sort of viewpoints of a foreign policy ideology, Clinton came from a much more sort of internationalist, sort of a liberal internationalist bent, whereas the Bush administration was a very sort of neoconservative administration, bent on primacy. But regardless, both saw India as a very important partner, not just for the rise of China, but because certainly at the time it was seen as a relationship enmeshed in sort of common quote unquote liberal values such as democracy. Obviously, as you suggested, those that aspect of the relationship has come under increasing scrutiny, certainly given India's sort of backsliding both on when we talk about majoritarianism or Hindu nationalism, as well as democratic values and liberal values. Um, as well as trade and economic investment and so on. India is a huge market for American companies. It's a primarily English-speaking country with more than a billion people that can conceivably in a more globalized world work for American companies from India. A lot of Indian immigrants settle in the U.S. The Indian immigrant population is one of the most highly successful ethnic groups when we talk about educational attainment, when we talk about socioeconomic attainment. Indian Americans start a lot of businesses, are very successful on Wall Street. They're very successful in Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of connections between India and the US beyond China, but certainly from a geopolitical perspective, China, certainly in the last, I would say, 15 years, 15 or 20 years, has been the primary driver of this relationship at a geopolitical level. So India is seen as a very important ally in Washington. That's not to say the people in Washington are always perfectly happy with India. For instance, in the recent Russia crisis, for the Russia-Ukraine war, you've seen some distance between the DC position and the New Delhi position. But that happens amongst allies. It's normal to disagree with your allies on certain things and agree with them on other things. So I don't think that things like the Russia-Ukraine war spells doom for the U.S. relationship with India or anything like that. I think it has from an IR perspective, the most solid relationship is based on a common threat, right? You can forget a lot of things on when you have a common threat, and both Washington and New Delhi see China as a threat. So a lot will follow from that, and a lot will be forgiven in given those concerns. So
So,
you mentioned human rights issues, and I'll just close
yeah.
with this. You mentioned human rights issues, and it's very easy to look the other way if you're Washington on human rights concerns. I mean, this is a standard sort of. There's nothing controversial about the claim that Washington and the West in general treat human rights issues very differently in countries where they have a geopolitical alliance versus countries where you don't have a geopolitical alliance, right? So the exact same thing that happens in Iran is cause for regime change, but if it happens in Saudi Arabia or Egypt, you know, it's not a big deal. So I expect India to not really have any significant skepticism or questions raised about its human rights record, as long as it's deemed a balancer in the larger political game against China.
Well, since we're talking about this question of international order, and we're talking about human rights, this question of human rights used to be a leverage with the Americans. But over the period of time, we have realized that the Chinese have bounced back to the Americans, for example, on this Black Lives Matter and all these movements, even in the US. So, do you think that this question of human rights won't have that much significance, or it won't give much leverage to the America when it goes globally, particularly when President Biden said that we are going to make Saudi Arabia as a prior state during his campaign, but he had to go to Saudi Arabia. And then if they speak of Chinese, the Chinese they just bounce back. So how do you see that? Do you think that this question of human rights is not going to get value over the period of time?
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, it sort of depends on the power dynamics between the countries. So I think, for instance, you mentioned two cases: the U.S. and China, and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. In both cases, obviously, the U.S. has less leverage than in other cases, right? Saudi Arabia is a very important country for the U.S. As in terms of energy needs, in terms of larger geopolitical currents in the Middle East. China is obviously the world's second most powerful state. So, there's superpower rivalry there. So the US only has very limited leverage with both of those countries, although it probably has a lot more leverage with Saudi Arabia than China, but especially in the middle of an energy crisis, uh, Saudi Arabia's leverage goes up, which we're in the midst of. So I suppose my answer to your question would be the extent to which human rights plays a role in U.S. foreign policy is first determined by the amount of the power dynamics or the power differential. In general, human rights is a cudgel that the U.S. can beat up much smaller and much weaker powers, but not generally larger powers. And then it also depends on the domestic dispensation here in Washington. I mean, President Trump for 4 years was very explicit about the fact that he didn't care at all about human rights, and he was embracing the worst human rights abusers as a almost as a matter of pride. He had this one very famous picture with I believe the Egyptian president and the Saudi president and the Israeli. I think the Israeli prime minister was there as well. I'm not quite sure, but it was like it's like if you could pick the worst human rights abusers in the Middle East, you'd pick those guys, and they were sort of. So I mean, the point is that the domestic elections, and the domestic politics also matters here. If you elect a person who doesn't care at all about human rights, then that's going to seep down through the bureaucracy. So it depends very much who's in power, and then how much power the other country has to ward off any any admonishments on the score.
Hmm. So, Mr. Butt, over the period of time, what we have realized is that Pakistan, which used to depend on the American uh, global designs or the American global ambition, for instance, during the Cold War, Pakistan went into this jihad project. We raised, maintained, and now we even kept sustaining these jihadis. And now we supported the Americans in this war against terrorism. And now, since the Americans have left Afghanistan, it seems that all that global order, which is rising, Pakistan is nowhere, and Pakistan is of no value, in fact, in terms of when it comes to this developing global changes. So, how do you see Pakistan when the Americans are thinking about Indo-Pacific? Largely, do you think they look Pakistan from the Chinese lens, or do you think that they value Pakistan in a different way?
I certainly think if you use the term value, Pakistan has very low value right now in Washington. Um, I don't think Pakistan is. So I'll answer both of your. I mean, let's answer your first question first. Is it viewed through the China lens? Not exclusively, and not even primarily. I would say Pakistan is not seen as a major uh, player in that larger superpower game, the way India might be, for instance, or the way the East Asian countries might be. Not just Japan and South Korea, but countries like Vietnam, for instance. Uh, I'm not sure Pakistan is seen through the lens of superpower competition in China. I think Pakistan is seen primarily through the lens of for better or worse, for issues like terrorism, for issues like national security, cooperation on groups like Al Qaeda, but nothing more than that. So, as for value, I think given the very difficult nature of the alliance that you spoke of, especially in the so-called war on terror since 2001, um, especially I mean, yeah, It's really been a bipartisan detachment. It The skepticism first started under George W. Bush. It was turned from skepticism to outright sort of distaste, and in some cases hostility under the Obama administration, and then Trump sort of completed it with some of his statements uh, and even if you chart things like financial aid and economic aid, they've been they went from billions of dollars to essentially nothing in the last 15 years. So certainly Pakistan is not seen as a valuable ally in Washington. It's not seen as a helpful ally. We can debate if you would like. We can debate the sort of justifiability of that view, but either way, that is the view. And uh, so no, I would say that Pakistan is not seen as a prize to be won per se, as, oh, we have to have these guys on our side in this larger superpower game. Now every time there's a war in Afghanistan, yes, you know so if you're waiting for a war in Afghanistan, every 10 or 20 years to cement your geopolitical alliances, sure, but beyond that, Pakistan does not have much to offer. Our economy is not well integrated into the world economy. Uh, we you know we're not a big economic player. We're not a big diplomatic player. So yeah, I think our influence and our value is pretty limited right now in Washington.
Mm. Yeah, this is what we have been talking since long, that if Pakistan has to move on with the US, that needs to be beyond the security lens. One last question, and that is about China. When the Pakistani authorities speak on the question that we cannot join any bloc, for instance, we cannot join Chinese bloc, we cannot join the American bloc. How do you see this assertion is viewed that since Pakistan wants to stay in both the blocks? So do you think? What is the general perception about Pakistan is that it is in the Chinese bloc and it's no more in the American bloc. So do you think that Pakistan can keep a balance in its relations between China and the US? The way the Indians have kept a balance between the Americans and the Russians, do you think that Pakistan has that leverage, or at some point Pakistan will be forced to change its position, or Pakistan will be left with no choice?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think the first way I would approach it is by thinking more at a general level, because I think what happened during the Cold War, when you had these two very solid blocks of the Eastern Bloc and the NATO countries in the West, I think that sort of solidified in people's minds, in the collective sort of minds of analysts and observers, that superpower relations are generally like that. That generally you will have two very sort of well-formed and rigid blocks. And I'm not sure that the U.S.-China relationship will necessarily replicate that. If you look at human international political history in the era of states, or even the era of empires, it's very rare for alliance patterns to be as rigid as they were in the Cold War. Generally, there's a lot of shifting. Generally, there's a lot of hedging. You have especially minor powers generally trying to play both sides. So as a general matter, I think the idea of two rigid blocks may be too overplayed in the popular imagination, and certainly in the case of East Asia today, East Asian countries themselves are very wary of being dragged into this sort of new Cold War per se, right? So if you look at more minor powers in East Asia, such as Vietnam, but even more minor than that, such as Singapore or Malaysia. Uh, they are all very keen to sort of not get dragged into a larger conflict between the U.S. and China. As the old saying goes, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So, so I think Pakistan can certainly hope to replicate that. I don't think there's anything structural that per se that says Pakistan can't play both sides or we can't hedge. I think hedging is totally plausible. Now, whether it actually happens, I think depends on who's in power in Islamabad, who's in power in Rawalpindi, how do they think about it. But certainly, as a general matter, I think hedging is a perfectly good strategy. And I think more importantly, both the US and China will be perfectly happy with Pakistan as a hedger. Um, I mean, it can be both seen as a good thing or a bad thing, right? You can see it as a bad thing, like, oh, we're not valued, like we're not seen as a big enough player that you have to have us on your side. But by the same token, it can also be a good thing because you're not being forced to take sides, right? The US, the US is not so gung ho that Pakistan has to be with it in this large. India, yes, right? Japan, yes. South Korea, yes, but not necessarily Pakistan. China, by the same token, doesn't want to be responsible, or doesn't want to be seen as responsible as, or doesn't essentially want another North Korea on its hands, right? Where it's the patron or the sort of the guardian for a troublemaker state. It would rather have Pakistan take care of itself and have a more normal relationship, a more normal give and take relationship. They don't want to be responsible for bailing us out all the time, like they're being asked to bail us out right now economically. So I think both the US and China would be perfectly happy with Pakistan hedging. I would be perfectly happy with Pakistan hedging. But the question is, are Pakistani leaders perfectly happy with Pakistan hedging? And I think there is a natural proclivity, certainly in Rawalpindi, for to see the US much more skeptically than China in general. Now, one army chief might be different from another army chief, and one prime minister might be different from another prime minister. But in general, it seems to be the case that the US attracts more skepticism amongst policy circles in Islamabad and Pindi. But so like I said, it sort of depends on them. But I think both superpowers would be totally happy with us hedging.
Hmm. Yes, obviously, Pakistan have to fix so many things to have a position in the international system or to be valued properly as Pakistan wants to be valued. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan Bhatt, for your time and for helping our viewers to understand how things are shaping globally and how you view things. And obviously, this input will value a lot to the memory of our viewers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.